Hello, my name is Ian Watson, and I am a Director Emeritus of the American Membrane Technology Association, also known as AMTA. The interview you're about to see is the 24th in a series of what we call Chats with the Pioneers. AMTA is a technical association founded on the advocacy of the use of membranes for water treatment from wastewater reclamation and reuse to seawater desalination. The heart of this technology is the membrane itself. About 3 years ago, the board of directors of AMTA decided that to preserve the history of membrane and membrane system development, the association should record, or should make an effort to record these chats to preserve the history in an archival form. AMTA's intent is to make this interview and the others available on their website so that a new generation of engineers and scientists can view them and understand the work that went into making this technology the way it is today and in worldwide use. The group we have today all worked for a company called DSS Engineers. I think I'm right in saying, and I'm sure if I'm not, one of these gentlemen will correct me, that DSS Engineers on its founding was probably the first purely desalting focused engineering firm at least in the United States and possibly elsewhere as well. To my right is Geoff Hart. In the center is Jorg Menningmann. And to my far right is O.J. Morin. I'd like to start by asking each of you, if you would, to give us a recap of your educational background and your history in the desalination and membrane-related technology. Geoff, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I was raised in Miami, and my dad was an engineer, and I went to University of Florida and graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. And first job I had out of school was working on oil tankers out of San Francisco for Standard Oil of California, marine engineering. So I got my feet wet, so to speak, in salt water. And although not much of it was involved in desalination, and was out there about 4 years, and then took a short sabbatical to sail around the Caribbean. I had gone to school with Bill Surratt, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. But anyway, he ended up, while I was sailing, he ended up working at DSS. And at that time, DSS consisted of OJ, Don Hornberg, and Bill Surratt. And then at that point in time, I became ultimately the fourth engineer in the firm. We were doing a lot of seawater distillation work at the time, mostly multi-stage flash evaporators, and just starting to do a little bit of membrane work. My first assignment was writer and editor of chapters for a project for Office of Water Technology, which I guess was the successor of the old OSW. But anyway, so that was my first membrane treatment-related project. We did a lot of things to pay the bills, a lot of energy-related R&D, saline water, utilization projects, extracting minerals from saline water of different sorts in Iceland and in Egypt, in addition to pursuing the desalination work. Worked with DSS altogether something like 15 years or maybe a little more. And ultimately, OJ and Don sold the company to Stone & Webster Engineering out of Boston. And that was while I was overseas in Saudi Arabia working at Al Jubail Phase 2, which was the world's largest desal plant at the time. It was a multi-stage flash plant. about 240 MGD as I recall. But anyway, ultimately I ended up getting more into municipal work and went to work for Montgomery Watson in the early 90s and stayed with them roughly 10 years, I guess it was. And during that time, worked on several membrane plants, in addition to all the other things that Montgomery Watson does, all the other municipal water and wastewater work. And then went to Hazen and Sawyer, where I still am employed, and did actually a lot more intensive nanofiltration and RO plant design work. And the last major job in terms of design that I worked on was the town of Jupiter nanofiltration plant that I worked on with Ian. And since business has slowed down for everybody, for me, the membrane plant work has dropped off somewhat in terms of design, but we still do a lot of operations consulting and smaller projects.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Jorg, how about you?
Well, I was a yearling out of college with DSS engineers, actually. All these great engineers were there before me and had founded the company, as Geoff had just said. And I guess I got there in 1978, 79, and was put to work on one of the reports that Geoff mentioned for the Office of Water Research and Technology, which was the basically a study into the commercialization of membrane desalination at the time. And so I spent 2 years working on that report with a couple of colleagues. Serge Latour was one of them. He and I believe Jack Anderton were listed as the co-authors on that. I think that was the second report that had been done by DSS, and the first one, I guess it was OWRT as well. And that one encompassed about 30 plants, smaller plants. Membranes weren't applied very much at that time, and they were places like Gillette, Wyoming, and the road stations outside between Phoenix and California and Bermuda and the Caribbean, and a few small plants out here in Florida, developers inland that didn't have any water supply. So we studied seawater plants, brackish water plants, ED plants. EDR was just getting started then, which was a wonderful thing for ED technology, of course. So I sort of got the fast track lesson in education and membrane applications and the pitfalls of it and design aspects of it. So of course I had some great guys that knew about corrosion and all the other things that went with distillation and their previous membrane experience to help. So that was a great opportunity for me to grow early in my career. I probably got writer's cramp and decided to move on to manufacture of systems, and that was Basic Technologies. And just to go back a little bit, I have an ocean engineering degree out of FAU and co-op to DSS, and then I moved from DSS after a couple of years there to Basic Technologies, which was Paul Culler and William Hendershaw, some people you might know. And that was pretty much full systems for home development and resort development in the Caribbean and Florida. And we did a little bit of work in Saudi Arabia. And you could call that municipal, but it was more commercial, I would say. So then Continental Water Systems, a division of Millipore Corporation, which was one of the largest ultra-pure water suppliers in the country to electronics, pharmaceutical, boiler feed water, what have you, came along and offered me a position there, and so I moved into that and spent a couple of years with, about 3 years with Continental Water Systems in high purity water systems for both electronics, pharmaceutical, biotech, etc., veterinary supplies, everywhere it's used. And then transitioned from there into process membrane applications, because Millipore was, as you know, they're in the biomedical field, pharmaceutical field, more heavily than anything else, and it was actually antibiotic concentration with our own membranes, things of that sort in combination with liquid chromatography, process liquid chromatography, which is another separation technique, non-membrane, but in combination we could purify, you know, isotopes from soup, basically. And I did that for a few years till about 1986 and 87, and I had a couple of kids by then, and I was working as a sales engineering manager for a territory, traveling all over, and I wanted to come back to Florida, and found a company called Water Equipment Technologies in West Palm Beach, Florida. And that was a company that Larry Stinger had started many years ago in the manufacture of cartridge filters. And probably, well, had applied serial #1 film tech element in an RO system. I think he had it somewhere for 5 years, sent it back to film tech on a plaque at one time, because who knew that company was going to go that far, but it was a great product, obviously, and still is today. So went to work there, and they were primarily doing a little bit of everything, commercial work, medical water, industrial water in Florida. There wasn't large industry, but there's a lot, things like hemodialysis water, things like that. So, and I got Larry to start thinking about a bigger spectrum of plants and started a desalination product line there, and grew that until we were selling quite a bit in the Caribbean, and in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Abu Dhabi, Egypt, and did pretty well and grew that company from a few $1 million to a little over $10 million and sold it in 1996. At that time, I was a partner of it. So after that, the company that bought us was called Waterlink, and they were going around sort of like U.S. Filter did some years ago, buying up and crafting a large conglomerate water company, and that was their idea, is to craft this company. And they bought some biotreatment technologies and screening technologies, and they bought our company, and they bought a company called Treat in Houston, which did strictly offshore platform and exploratory hydrocarbon ships, just water makers for those, for that equipment. So we had one office there, and we called that the Pure Water Division, which I became president of for Waterlink. Then came the dot-com bubble and everything that went with it, and banks tightening up, and this highly leveraged company ended up having to sell division by division, trying to collect itself into a better financial posture. And that sort of happened, but it didn't happen. They eventually sold it all. They had a company called Barnaby Sutcliffe, which was a competitor against Calgon that did all kinds of carbon absorption technology at the time. And we were the second to the last division they sold. There was 5 divisions, the Pure Water Division, and then they sold Barnaby Sutcliffe. This was 2002, so it took a few years because nobody was buying anything for a while there. And then, of course, 9/11 occurred, which we were supposed to be bought by Pentair on 9/11, and so that never got signed. And then about June of 2002, ITT came along and had bought the Pure Water Division from Waterlink. So Treat and Water Equipment Technologies, the original companies, now belong to ITT, who has recently turned into Xylem because of they separated. ITT was a conglomerate company, industry company that was both in defense electronics, water, big in pumps, biggest pump company in the world, and also then general industry like car parts and shocks and brake pads and things of that nature. So they split on Wall Street in 2011, became 3 independent companies. And I'm still with them today as a director of business development for the Global Projects Group, which is basically assimilating all their technologies into solutions for clients. And over the years, some of the projects moved away from industrial. Once we came to ITT, they're primarily a municipal company. So a few of the projects that I worked on is, I put in the project in first large seawater desalination plant in Dubai for DEWA. And that was 113,000 cubic meter a day. And we're installing now a plant that I was part of the team worked on for in Doha, which is a 200,000 cubic meter per day UF tertiary treatment plant, along with our biological treatment in front of it. That's probably enough, isn't it?
Well, it's an interesting and varied career. And we worked together on a project in North Carolina.
Yes, yes, we have.
OJ, you were one of the founding members of DSS Engineers, and
Yeah.
but you were involved in desalination long before that.
Yeah, I started probably before Jorg was born. It was back a few years.
I don't look at you that way.
Grew up in Connecticut, went to the University of Connecticut, got a BS in engineering, and they told us when we graduated, don't go out and get a job. You're ready for graduate school. Don't go get a job. Well, my father wouldn't pay for graduate school, so I went out and got a job. And I worked at Connecticut Light and Power for a couple of years, 3 years, at a power plant. And working for a utility, you have absolutely nothing to do. You're not responsible for anything. You don't have to do anything. So after 3 years of being bored silly, I answered an ad for, was written as pressure vessel design. It was Don Hornberg. He was looking for 2 people, he told me. He told me after he hired me. He told me he was looking for 2 people. One that could do pressure vessel design for cartridge filters or filters for Cuno. Because the Cuno had, no, I guess AMF had bought Cuno and Maxim Evaporator Group from Connecticut. And everybody was put up in Meriden, Connecticut in Cuno. And so Don needed a pressure vessel designer and a desalination engineer. Because they did MSF units, MED units. They even got started RO back then.
This was Maxim.
Maxim,
Maxim, yeah.
So anyway, I went in and interviewed, and next day he told me I was hired. You're going to be our evaporator designer. Oh, that's interesting. I've never designed anything, but this is what I wanted to do. But it turns out that he interviewed the guy he hired for pressure vessel. He interviewed him the day before me and hired him for evaporator designing. After he interviewed me, he went and told the guy, you're going to be doing a pressure vessel designing. And so anyway, I did my first MSF design using a slide rule, which took an entire 40, 50, 60 hours to balance. This is the first one I did was, I think it was a 4 or 6 stage unit. Using the slide rule was fun. Now it takes, what, a nanosecond or something to do a 36 stage? Anyway, I worked there for a couple of years and then moved on to Westinghouse, where I worked on one of the Westinghouse's first plant that went into Kuwait. And I got to order all the nuts and bolts. I got to design the air ejector system. And then one night, one of the guys came down the hall. Anybody want to go down to St. Thomas? I said, yeah, I'll go. For the next 3 years, I was in the field. I was never home. Went down to St. Thomas, St. Croix, Honduras, where I blew up the unit one day with a water hammer. And then I went on vacation one summer, and when I got back, the guy a friend of mine, Fran Faulkner, who just passed away recently, said, you better call the office. And I called the office, why? You don't have a job anymore. I said, I don't? No, they closed the office the day after you left. So everybody's had a 2-week start on getting a new job. So anyway, I tried getting work at Westinghouse. I was in California. I liked it there. I interviewed with Edison, the power company there. I interviewed with Westinghouse itself. And Westinghouse could guarantee me 1 day home a month. I thought, well, that's a little bit much. So anyway, at the same time, we were talking to Don about forming this consulting firm, DSS Engineer. So I was not that interested because I was comfortable in California. I loved it there. The golfing was great there. I just loved the place. I wanted to stay there. So I was putting Don off, putting him off. And I
So
went
where was Don at this point?
Pardon?
Where was Don at this point?
Oh, he was working in New Jersey for Foster Wheeler
Okay.
as their evaporated, and he had designed that test unit they had in San Diego at Point Loma, was it?
Right.
And he was running that so he was out in California every month or so. And every time he came out, we talking about forming this company. So anyway, I interviewed and interviewed. I didn't want to go back with Westinghouse, and but I was interested in going back to the power company because they had a great golf league.
So this was one of the drivers for your career moves? Was
Exactly,
golf?
yeah.
It was the driver.
So anyway, I never heard from the power company, and I told Don, yeah, okay, I'll come down to Florida. You want to start it in Fort Lauderdale, where the impetus for that was Bob Bailey, one of the first 3 partners, Bob, Don, and myself. So I said, I'll take the job. And the day before the moving company came, the power company called. We want to give you a job. I said, Jesus, if you had called me 2 days ago. So anyway, I went down to Fort Lauderdale, and we started Desalting Systems and Services.
And what year was that?
68,
68.
1968. Totally dedicated to a career in consulting in the desalination field. But by about 2 years, we decided that there's not enough work in this field to keep us going. So we changed the name to DSS Engineers, and at that time we had the big oil crisis, and we got all kinds of jobs from DOE. Geoff did one of them. Bill Swatt did another one, or we used geothermal heat from the field out in California. What's the name of that field?
Yeah, down in El Centro.
Yeah,
I can't
right,
remember
yeah.
the name of the field.
Actually, and we used the isobutane as the medium for spinning the turbine. We actually lit a light bulb. They told me, I never saw it.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. It was a direct contact heat exchanger, which meant that the brine and the isobutane liquid were in direct contact without a heat exchanger wall in between. So
Yeah, it was. I always thought we'd sell millions of those, but never.
Never did?
Never, never did. Let's see. So then, that's when Geoff mentioned this job in Iceland. That was MED plant, 3 Effects, where they wanted to recover the salt. They didn't need the fresh water. They wanted the salt for packing, for shipping fish around the world. So we designed them the pilot plant, and they ran that. It worked fine. But when it came to the tubing material, I thought, holy crap, we've got this brine at 250 or 60 degrees, loaded with silica. I mean, it's vicious stuff. So we're going to have probably titanium for tubes. And the client says, oh, no, we'll just use carbon steel. Carbon steel? He said, yeah. He says, what happens is this brine is supersaturated with silica, and it lays down on the tubing, protects it. I said, yeah, but it's going to keep doing that till you don't have a tube anymore. So he ran the pilot plant for, I don't know, 6 months or a year, and then they built the actual plant, 10 million gallons a day, 3 Effect MED plant. and they sent me some salt, actually, in a little jug.
That was
That
kind.
was nice of
Yeah.
them. That was in lieu of payment.
That was the payment, yes.
So but DSS was independent for how long?
It's been 20 years. Well,
And so it was like 68 to 88,
yeah,
and then it was purchased by Stone and Webster.
yeah.
And
It was 80, it was actually, I think,
86?
85 or 86, yeah.
Yeah,
Right. But then, did you stay at Stone and Webster
yeah.
for a while?
I was supposed to stay 3 years, but I couldn't take it after a couple. Bailed off because what they did is the guys in Boston that had somebody they didn't want in their group anymore sent them to Fort Lauderdale. We ended up with all the has-beens and whatevers, and geez, those guys just didn't work. And then I took a job at Black and Veatch
I remember that.
for about 6 years, I guess. And then decided, I guess I can't work for anyone, so I started DSS Consulting in '96, and still have it today, where I'm doing consulting to WCI, Water Consultant International,
Mm-hmm.
Don's old company, and taking jobs overseas. I worked in Saudi for 3 years, lived there, worked there for 3 years, and then China for a couple of years. And then I took a job with an idiot in the Emirates, stayed a month.
Jorg, you went to a company that is unusual for somebody that's been in the desalting business at Millipore.
Mm-hmm.
And what sort of differences did you find there? Because they were involved in membranes as well.
They were. Well, Millipore actually invented, or they didn't invent, they actually got the technology of sterile filtration, absolute 0.2 filtration, from the Germans. And I don't remember exactly who it was, but somebody after the war had gotten the technology and started a business in his garage, because the thing that during the war, the Americans or the Allies couldn't understand how they could get, the Germans could have their water systems bombed out, and the next day they'd be drinking their water because they thought it'd all be contaminated. Well, they had these filters that took bacteria out of the water. They just filtered it and away they went, right? Somebody said that's some pretty good stuff, and that's how Millipore got started, and their Durapore filter was their sterile filtration product. And of course, sterile filtration is huge in the pharmaceutical and biotech and that line of work. So, and they went from there and they made some of their own membranes for industry. And they were mostly for high purity water systems for laboratory and things like that. Well, they went further and they bought a company called Continental Water Systems. And Continental Water Systems was out of El Paso, Texas. And they manufactured DI systems, deionization and reverse osmosis systems, primarily for industrial use, for high purity water production. So I went to work for that group in Millipore. So it really was a ultra pure water system that used membranes, and that's, to me, it was very interesting because so many more technologies were there. Learning about UV, learning about, you know, extractables from plastic pipe that you didn't want to get on electronic components because it short-circuited them. It was just an exciting opportunity to expand from basically UF&RO technology that I had, what I'd learned to that day, to get into something more expansive and more involved, and so I did. And they wanted to pay me more. That was probably the biggest reason.
That's
I was
a
getting.
good reason.
Yeah, that was the primary reason, come to think of it. Oh, forget all the other stuff, it was the money.
Actually, I saw two Continental systems on Ocracoke Island in North Carolina
Yes.
for
Yes.
municipal work
Yes,
with B9 permeators.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved in that.
Were you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was out there, and when I first time I went to Ocracoke, I couldn't believe that. I couldn't quite understand the people, and I didn't know what the dialect was.
That's right.
And I was trying to figure out the dialect so I could maybe figure out what they were saying, you know? But I could never figure it out because it's something between Southern and British.
Yeah,
and that's
right.
pretty tough. Ian, you I understand. Southerners I understand, but mix those two together and it's
Yeah. Well,
it's
that
hard
was,
to understand.
if you look at the history of that part of the world, the people who lived on Ocracoke were so isolated from the rest of
Exactly.
not only the mainland, but also the Outer Banks,
Yeah.
that the only other place in North Carolina where they have the same kind of accent is out in western part of the state, up in the hills, where they've been also fairly isolated. And it's very close to Elizabethan English,
Yeah.
very close.
Well, you know, you got to take a ferry to get there.
Yeah, right.
And
Still do.
and I mean, there are descendants there that were there since their forefathers landed on the beach and just never moved inland. You know,
Right.
so it's obvious that it stayed that way. But it's that was quite unusual.
Yeah,
That
we went,
small
Barbara
project.
Escovitch, who you know,
Yeah.
and I went down there when we were getting ready to build the first RO plant, Kildover Hills.
Mm-hmm.
So we went down there, we took the ferry over and went to visit the plant. So the operators were saying, well, what are you going to do? And so we said, well, we're going to do this, this, and this. And said, well, what kind of membranes are you going to use? They said, well, we're going to have spirals. They said, oh, it'll never work. Apparently they're so isolated, they'd never heard of a spiral
Yes.
membrane.
Well, when I got started, hollow fiber was used 80% of the time
Yeah.
until they really wanted to try to use it on anything but a clean well water.
Right.
And then, of course, you know, seawater membranes, most of
Well,
the
as I
water is
recall, those
surface
systems
water.
down there had monomedia filtration in front of them because they had some iron issues in the wells.
Yes, yeah. There's, I don't remember exactly. That was a very complicated system. There was a lot of issues with it, as there was with the early days of RO plants, particularly with hollow fiber membranes, because even a well water, if anything precipitated out like H2S, you still had the same problem. And of course, that's why spiral membranes have taken over the marketplace. And there really isn't. I mean, there is some hollow fiber, but almost extinct.
Geoff, when you were working on the tankers, they had their own water makers.
Yeah,
Did
they
you get
were
involved in that at all?
just peripherally, not much at all. Yeah, we had submerged tube, multiple effect evaporators, MEDs. With submerged tubes, of course, you could only have a couple of effects, but and that was it. And RO at that point in time, this was, you know, starting in 1969, and then it was 73 when I left. But RO had not yet been introduced.
Right.
They had very rudimentary GPS systems for oil tankers for navigation that were just
Is that
in the
right?
experimental
Yeah,
stage way
yeah.
back then, yeah. Satellite navigation systems, but no RO. So, you know, the steamships were still in vogue because oil was still cheap until 73. And then steamships kind of disappeared almost overnight.
Right, right. Did you, when you first went to DSS, you were working on this study for the Office of Water Research Technology. I think I actually have a copy. It was a 3-volume
Yeah,
report,
I think it
was
was
it not?
done, and there were
Yeah.
2 different contracts. The first one I worked on, the second one Jorg worked on.
Apart from the studies that you were doing, when did DSS actually design an RO plant?
I think it was either a very small brackish plant for the Autech base in Andros Island. I mean small. It had Dow fine fiber permeators, and it was only a couple 100,000 gallons per day. Got its water from a shallow infiltration gallery. But anyhow, and then about the same time, OJ designed the Al Burq seawater RO plant in Saudi Arabia.
And that would be what year?
68.
Yeah.
78.
78, yeah.
Because I think that was just before I went to work for Hydronautics.
That plant is still running.
Is it really?
There's some quirk. When I specified the materials for it, I specified 316. I thought that was the best we could use at the time. This is 1978. As soon as I wrote the spec, one of SWIC's corrosion consultants, the famous guy from England,
Oh, Todd?
Todd.
Yeah.
Brian Todd,
Yeah.
Yeah.
came to me and says, OJ, you got the wrong material. I said, you know, I had to have the spec out in a week. And he's telling me, oh, you got to start all over again? I said, why? And he just explained this, and he said, you got to be over 40, and 316 was only 32 or 34 or something. So it's going to fall apart in 6 months. Well, it's still running. It's 30 years now, I guess. And after that plant, I did the famous Bahrain Ad-Dur plant.
Ad-Dur, yeah.
That I wasn't involved after the award of the contract to the contractor. And then they changed the pretreatment system, and that's why it never ran to capacity. But anyway, I think you worked on that job.
Did I?
Yes, in fact, I think I gave you the pretreatment
Well,
system.
thank you.
No wonder it doesn't work.
No, they took out, we specified 2 stages, they took one out. Anyway, that one I did in 370, and I wasn't allowed to use the expensive 254 SMO because the Saudis told me in the first meeting, this is a gift from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain.
To Bahrain, right.
So we want it to look good, but we don't want to spend any money on it. So I did that one in 317. That sucker's still running too without problems. Now SWIC did a survey about 10 years ago of all their RO plants. And there are 42 plants or something. Every single one that was 316, 317, and that vintage of stainless steel has had all kinds of problems, except those 2 plants.
Isn't that funny?
Because
Because the one
you
that,
use Schedule 80 and they use Schedule 40.
No?
the one that Polymetrics did about the same time, it's like 76 or 77. I mean, that fell apart after about 8 months.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that scared the beans out of me when the corrosion guy came, because, you know, here's DSS is just starting with this new client, this SWIC client. This we can make a lot of money on them, and here we go. We're going to design them a plant that falls apart in 6 to 8 months, a year. We're going to be out of there. For some reason, and I talked to the stainless steel guys at a conference in China a couple of years ago, and they hadn't a clue.
It's funny, isn't it? Our Burke was built by a Saudi company, wasn't it?
The first job they ever did. You want to hear about the bid?
Yeah.
The bid opening was a big room full of people. There was about a dozen bidders. And the director was standing up there. I was sitting down next to him taking notes. And we got all done with bidding. The low bidder was some Saudi company that had never done a job before. The second lowest bidder was a Saudi company that had never done a job before. That was Al Kafter. And so we got through with all the bids. And a guy jumps up and he says, Your Excellency, I have a letter. So I jumped up and said, don't take it. You can't take any letters. This is a public bid opening. He says, why not? So we took the letter and he opened it up and he said, look it. Al Kafler has reduced their price 10%. They are now the low bidder. And they gave him the job. And I often want, that was Bushneck.
Yeah, Adel Bushneck. That's
I
right.
often want to ask Adel, did he have a 10% pocket and 15% iron?
Yeah, he probably did.
Probably did, yeah.
But that was a B10 plant, right? DuPont B10 permeators.
Yep.
What are they doing now? If it's still running, they must have converted it to spirals.
I had one client in Morocco that did that. They didn't convert to spirals. They use the
Toyobo?
Toyobo
Yeah,
membranes.
yeah.
And they say they work very good. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, the Toyobos went into both the big Jetta plants
Yeah.
that Bechtel did. And they were, I mean, I saw papers that were presented 10, 12 years later, and the membranes were doing very well,
Yeah.
which kind of surprised me, but.
Yeah, me too, because I never liked the membrane because...
Was that the cellulose membrane where they're putting chlorine in the water, feeding chlorine? And
Yeah.
that was why they lasted over a
Yeah.
PA membrane,
Yeah.
right? They
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
foul up
yeah,
on
sure. But they, you
biology.
would think that, and I forget if it's a blend acetate or if it's just triacetate.
Try, I think.
Yeah,
just
CTA
triacetate?
is triacetate.
Yeah.
They, and I don't think that they lower the pH that much, so I would have thought they would have hydrolyzed over a period
Wow,
of
yeah.
time. But apparently not, so.
Well, I had
Who
the
knows?
plant...
The
It's like
CAs were
Yeah.
subject to hydrolysis
Maybe
very
it's
easily.
like the stainless steel, you know?
Mm.
Exactly.
Who knows?
What's this PREN number, you know? And then when you look at the MED field, and Sedum uses, all their stainless steel is less molybdenum than 316, and their plants are
Really?
working fine.
Mm.
But
Oh.
they use a higher chrome?
It
Well,
varies
it's
throughout
moly
their
and
plant, but-
chrome. The chrome is less important as the moly and the nickel, and
Yeah, the
you
moly
got to
and
add them
nickel.
all up to get your 40. But
Yeah.
when we started building the package plants at WET in 316 and even Schedule 80, it's 360 now, 370, we had horrendous times, and we had to convert right away to the Xeron material at the time, or the 254, and that was okay as long as there wasn't a thread. And then we realized that the problems came when the plant was shut down. So then we started a permeate water flush, which wasn't being done at the time.
Right.
They had the suckback tanks,
Yep.
Yeah.
and they were doing that with spirals as they were converting spirals, thinking they needed the same thing, but that was never needed for spirals. It was just something that grew over on the PNIDs, if you would. And because the hollow fibers had a tendency to blow up because of the architecture of the fiber. The spirals didn't have that problem. You could shut one of those things down, you never damage the membrane. But so we said, well, we want to flush the membrane for that reason, thinking we want to get the seawater out and get the biology out so it didn't grow, but primarily to get the stagnant seawater out, because that pitting around the threaded
Right, yeah.
points just went anyway, even on
That's right.
on the best material.
Yeah, so why haven't they had the problems at Alberg and at Dura? I don't know. It doesn't make any
Yeah, that's
sense, because we have all the same threaded fittings all over the place. I know when the plant first started operating, I didn't go in the membrane room. That was a separate room, because as soon as you open the door, it was like a mist. You couldn't see anything but mist in there, you know. And I always thought something's going to blow up. Never did, and they still run the plant today. I don't.
So one of the great stories that I've heard from DSS engineers, which has nothing to do with membranes, was Farrasan Island. So you didn't go there.
No.
You went there.
Yeah.
Did you go
And
there?
I spent 3 months there,
Do
yes.
you want to tell us about Farrasan Island and why it's become a legend almost in the industry?
It has.
Oh, yeah.
Farazan Island is a reef that sticks out of the ocean.
It's a rock
It's a
covered
rock.
with red, very fine red dust.
Yeah, and the rock and the roads weren't paved, and driving over them was like murder to your back. We got this job from the Saudis. It was our first job over there, and Bill Surratt and I went over to pick a site. So we're walking around. We were there for a week, I guess, and we're walking around the second day, whatever it was, and we found this place. It looked like a good site. So I stripped down and I was diving in, and the people all started screaming. So I stopped, and they went, "What's on?" "There's sharks in the water," they said. I said, "We got to find out what the depth is." So I swam out and found, this isn't too bad a place. So we selected a site.
Highly scientific.
Yeah, highly, highly. and then Bill and I attempted to survey the site. Well, we did something. We made a drawing out of it. And they hired, I guess the contractor was Krupp.
Krupp Atlas, yeah.
And they hired Hyundai to do the civil work. Now that rock was all dug up by hand using pickaxe. They didn't have a jackhammer.
Yeah, what happened was the Saudis wouldn't let them import dynamite for security reasons. And so they obviously needed a few pipe trenches and so forth. Some excavation had to be done. They would drill holes in the rock, and then they would try to fracture it with various forms of jackhammers. And this would go on all night long. Well, not all night. It would go on till midnight under lights every night outside my construction trailer. But anyway, ultimately they failed. So what they did was, well, we'll dig down a little bit, we'll cast our concrete trenches, and then we'll import fill from God knows where on the island and build the whole site up. And ultimately that's what they did. But it was quite a place. There was not a doctor on the island. It was very primitive. We had to get there on Hyundai's tugboat.
Tugboat, yeah.
And it was a 6-hour trip from Jazan. And we had to bring the food down with the contractor. They would bring frozen chickens and stuff down on the Saudia airplane from Jeddah. And anyway, then we would take the coolers and put them on the tugboat for the long ride to Farazan.
Was it inhabited?
It was barely inhabited, yeah. You went to
Yeah, it was used by smugglers, mainly, they said, from Africa and from
So why were they
Saudi.
building a plant there?
Oh, because
To give water to the smugglers?
to give water to the people. There was a small town there, maybe 200 or 300 people. And the water they had was over 3,000 ppm. You couldn't even go near it. It smelled so badly. But that's all they had to drink. And the Saudis always said, you build a water plant and the people will come. I said, where are they going to come from? There's nothing on this island. But they had a jail on it, and they had, when I was there, one prisoner, they said, in it. And it was a place, because I went to visit all the ministries before they started the job, because you had to inform them of what we were doing on the Farazan, and every one of them said, would laugh. Oh, it's Farazan, and they started laughing. What's the matter? Oh, when I was a kid, my mother always said, if you don't behave, I'm sending you to Farazan Island.
Farazan is the largest island in the Red Sea, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah,
Huh. That's interesting.
Big rock.
big rock.
So what other, as you get closer to the time when Stone and Webster became involved, did you do more RO work than thermal?
Yeah. I mean,
It took a long time, though.
yeah.
The thermal work persisted well into the
Yeah.
80s.
yeah, because we were working for SWIC mostly, and
Yeah.
SWIC, was Al Gobaisi's famous saying that, MSF plant is robust, but the RO plant's made of plastic. So you couldn't rely on them, That's because he had purchased, I guess 3 RO plants, 1 MGD each from the Italians. Their
Yeah.
first.
And he had the ones he got from Envirogenics as well. You remember that?
Mhm.
Remember those?
No.
What were they called? They were like 1 MGD each as well.
Yeah.
But Envirogenics, they didn't have a seawater membrane. And so it was really a 2-stage brackish water plant, or 2-pass brackish water plant.
Well,
And they fell apart after like a year.
Well, he bought the plans, and then he called us up and said, "You be our engineer." And I said, "Okay, fine." So he sent the drawings. I looked at them and said, "There's no pretreatment. There's a sand filter ahead of the RO." So I called up, what's his name that used to run the Italian outfit, Italian Pianti, Dr. Bersani.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't going to work. He says, "That's all they bought." I said, it's going to fail, and then is your name. He didn't care, so they built them, and they didn't work. No pretreatment, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
What, a couple on Delma Island and another one somewhere else.
So at the height of your activities at DSS, how many people were there?
At the end, about 45.
Something like that, yeah.
Really? Whatever happened to Bob Bailey? And how did Bob Bailey get involved in the first place?
Well, it's Bob Bailey's idea. He was talking to Don first about starting the consulting firm in Fort Lauderdale. It had to be in Fort Lauderdale. Why?
That's where he lived?
That's just, he had his favorite bar was there. Same thing. I don't know. He was running the Key West plant at the time. He had gone through, he was at Westinghouse, and after they built the plant, he became the operator, the manager of the plant, and he was talking to Don, and then Don started talking to me, and then we started at those. They were the main partners, him and Don. But Bob, after about 3 years, decided he wasn't going to make his billions, so he was bailing out. He left the firm then, and Don and I carried it on.
He went to work for Coolgen.
He worked for Coolgen, I remember that.
For a while. And then he went to work for a heat exchanger manufacturer in the Houston area. And that was the last I knew of him.
Direct contact. He's still trying to sell it. He has now gotten an investor, a guy that brings in investors. This guy's like crook, because I worked for him on a job. I can't even remember now. Oh, it was like instant fresh water from seawater. And he had a phony rig running in New Mexico at the university there. Because I went down and looked at that, and I tried to explain to this guy, gave him the figures, showed him that this doesn't work. It's not going to work. It can't work. But he still wanted to build a pilot plant in his garage, which is in a nifty neighborhood in Atlanta, like right outside of Buckhead. Nobody's going to let you run something like this in their neighborhood. It could blow up anyway. He wanted it, but we finally parted because he wanted me to design it from wood, like the one they had in New Mexico. And I said, no, this is under pressure. Wood is just not going to do it.
So, Stone and Webster, having bought DSS engineers, then, not that much later, went belly up themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
So essentially the whole DSS, the old DSS group that was left there is gone.
Yeah, they did the last hurrah. They, as a contractor, they built the Cooper City nanofiltration plant as a contractor. It was a CH2M Hill design,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, being engineers, Stone and Webster re-engineered the plant.
We supplied it from the wet.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
that was a headache.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Nanofiltration. It was one of the biggest nanofiltrations in the plant.
It's a good plant.
Yeah.
It's a good plant. It's doing well still.
Designed well, built well.
They
Membranes
were
are
involved in Tampa
8,
Bay
9 years old.
desal initially.
Yeah.
That plant was unusual because the color of the water was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like, I don't know, was it
Black?
It wasn't black, but it was
Close to
very,
it?
very, yeah, it was tea, and it was, I don't know, it was 200-300 color units or something.
Jeez.
Ridiculous, and we were always worried about this stuff coming out on the membranes, and we were playing with the pH to make sure that it wouldn't, and using anti-scalants, and we were having problems because we did some piloting, if you remember, and come to figure out that anti-scalant was a problem and just let it go by itself. And the organic in the water was its own anti-scalant, in a sense, an old chelating agent.
Yeah.
And it ran fine.
Yeah, that's the way they run both.
We kind
as
of
well.
ran into the accidental perfect operational situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I tell you something about Ev Cedar?
Yeah.
You remember Ev Cedar?
Yeah.
He was the director of OSW.
Yeah.
We hired him at DSS. And our office was down on the beach at that time. He lived down there somewhere. But anyway, I was always the first one in the morning. I go in my office, and soon after that, Ev would come in. Talk about some plant we're doing in Key West, not Key West, but St. Thomas. And I'd be talking to Ev, and all of a sudden I look over and he's sound asleep. You do this every morning. Ev, am I keeping you awake? A hell of a nice guy.
Yeah, I remember him at OSW.
Hmm?
I remember him at OSW.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you would remember or not, but remember Bob Evans at OSW?
Yeah.
Who was the other guy that was in his office with him? Was it Bill something or other?
Yeah.
I was trying to remember his name the other day.
Last time I saw him, he had that ball valve heart thing. You could hear it clicking every time his heart would beat. Is he still around? Or?
Yeah, Bob Evans. We're actually going to interview Bob Evans.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, let's say hi to him when you see him.
I will. So, well, I'm sure we could tell stories for quite a while, but we ran out of time. I sure appreciate you guys coming. And, it's we've interviewed 3 or 4 of the early OEMs and membrane manufacturers and so on, but this is, I think, the only consulting firm that we've interviewed. And you're here because you were, in fact, the first purely desal-oriented consulting firm, and therefore certainly a pioneer in the industry. And so appreciate you being here. Geoff, Jorg, OJ, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.